I was
special interest.
really surprised to read that in the 1960s once, you and a friend pretended to be blind for a day. You blindfolded yourselves.
Yeah. Yes, I can't remember now quite why I decided to try this, but it just he and I were sort of looking after his sister's house in Maida Vale while she and her husband were in America for 6 months, and I just thought it would be a very interesting thing to do, and so we agreed we'd spend a weekend. And on Saturday morning, we got up and blindfolded each other very thoroughly using sort of masking tape. I mean, with a bit of cloth underneath, as far as I can remember. And in fact, it was extremely interesting. I mean, we got very good at sort of doing almost everything really quite fast. It was very tiring because you had to sort of concentrate on all the things that normally you just do automatically. And I mean, we were ambitious. We sort of cooked a lunch. We sort of grilled some chops and, cooked some vegetables. And the one thing we kept on putting our fingers in the butter, which we could never sort of, which was funny. And then you see, which later on in the day, I ventured outside, and then that was sort of, well, terrifying is a ridiculous word to use, but it was quite different because inside the house, you knew where you were. And nothing was very far away, and you were in a room, you knew where the furniture was, you could sort of thrash about until you hit something you recognised. You move up and down corridors, stairs. People always think that stairs are terrible for blind people. They're fine, because, unless you're living with mad people, they never leave anything on the stairs. There are handrails, so, the stairs are they're less of a problem than almost anything.
But were you...
The problem is the big open space. That's when you're done for.
You were not yet dedicated to art, were you?
Oh, yeah.
So how was it to be without colour?
Oh, well, I didn't paint at that point. I just wondered what it would be like. And I can't remember why. It's possible.
Strange prophecy,
It's
do you
possible
think?
a monkey... No.
I just wanted... You have a practical side, and I was just trying to distress it a bit.
I don't believe in any of that sort of stuff.
You studied first to be an engineer.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And if I'd met you when you were, 14 or 15 and said, what do you want to be when you grow up, what would you have said?
Professional footballer or cricketer.
That changed. When did you know yourself to be an artist?
Not until the sort of eureka moment, which was, I mean, I was always kind of I was always sort of a bit interested in art. My sister, who's 3 years older than me, she's much more artistic than I am. Seemed to be. She was the arty one. But we both drew and everything. And then when I was an apprentice, which was quite terrifying actually, because that was a bit terrifying, because I'd been to this school, Dartington, in South Devon, which was a very strange and sort of unworldly setup. Suited me a treat. And then I went straight into living in digs, with an outside loo and a factory in the 50s, early 50s. And I was a bit scared because I didn't know anything about ordinary people. But as the years went on, the 5 years that I was an apprentice, I sort of realised more and more, really, this wasn't the life for me. And kind of, I suppose, slightly developed an artistic persona.
And it was...
slightly on purpose, but also because it interested me.
It was always going to be the visual arts.
Yeah, but I mean, at that time, I wasn't remotely thinking of you know, of myself as an artist. It was just something I was interested in, and I did. And even when I finished my apprenticeship, I thought I'd read a maths degree. That's what I wanted to do, because I was good at maths. And we'd had a brilliant maths teacher at the technical college. And then, I mean, it was sort of silly because I didn't have any maths A-levels because I'd left school at 16.
If you'd had a guide to the future who had told you that you were going to lose your sight and be an artist, a painter, would you have believed it, that combination?
Absolutely not. I didn't believe it when it happened to me. I mean, well, you know because you've seen the film, but when I mean, it's funny, you see, I'd lived for 25 years knowing that I might go blind from my first retinal detachment. I knew that was definitely a possibility. But I had never dwelt on it. It's sort of not my nature. But the fact that the day after we got back from cataracts, you know, I had that hemorrhage and finally lost the little sight I'd got, and I kind of knew. I just knew as soon as I realised what happened that it was not going to be recoverable.
May I ask about your emotions at that time? Were you frightened or were you in despair at any point?
No. I wasn't frightened. I mean, I was... I thought, oh, bugger, this is what, you know, I've known might happen, and I'm pretty sure. I mean, I didn't know for certain, but I was virtually certain when Francis said, "Oh my God, your eye's bleeding." I was virtually certain that was it. And then an ophthalmologist who'd become a friend, he was head of the eye department in Norfolk and Norwich, but he lives not terribly far away, and I rang him up. And I mean, he was an amazing, wonderful man. It was Bank Holiday Monday, and he was over in about half an hour. He didn't say for sure, but he sort of confirmed he said, well, I think you're right, that probably is, you know, a total detachment, and there won't be anything that can be done about it. And then I just sort of thought, oh, you know, now what?
Now what? And I suppose now what? Did it include painting again?
No, I didn't think so at that time. Absolutely not. I mean, I went into hospital for a few days because they had to sort of patch up the eye. And then, I can't remember, what was it, about 2 days friendly, something like that. And then I came out, and I remember going into my studio and thinking, what the hell am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I'd been thinking, probably in hospital and then out about, I'd never really been much of a chap for sculpture. Actually, curiously, since then I have made some bits of sculpture, which, you know, might not be too bad. But I had some ideas about kinds of construction which might be a bit like sculpture and a bit like architects' models, and which would be to do with ideas about moving light about in spaces, even though I couldn't see the light. It was something I talked to my son about. He's very interested in architecture, and it's a sort of, he's been in California and places like that where some of the sort of ideas that interest me have actually been built. infinity swimming pools and that kind of thing.
But how did you find your way back to colour and...
Well, what happened was that I... and then, I mean, I was standing in there in the studio, and my head was full of these subjects from cataracts. I mean, it was only, a few days, 3 days or something, since we got back. And I had in my head about a dozen subjects which I intended to paint, and which, Peter had taken sort of photo montages of for me, and I'd painted gouaches when I was there, and I was thinking about them, and I was all set to go and everything, and I thought, what a waste. And then I was just feeling my way around, all the familiar stuff, and thinking, well, I can give all my paints and brushes to, any that Francis doesn't want, to my friend Graham Giles or Terry Raybould, painter friends of mine, and one thing and another. And then I felt a canvas which was about that size. Sorry, that's no good for radio, is it?
arm to arm, kind of.
Roughly speaking, a bit under 3 foot by rather more than 2 foot, I should say. And it was an unpainted canvas, and I just suddenly thought, well, I wonder what would happen if I did have a go. I mean, I've got the paint, which otherwise I'm going to give away. I've got this canvas. What's to be lost? And I thought, well, let's have a go. And I sort of played in my memory through these 12 or so subjects, and fairly quickly decided which one I would have a stab at. And I set it up on the windowsill outside my studio, which was where I liked to paint if it was sunny and warm, which it was, and sort of lifted out my painting trolley exactly as I would have done, when I could see, and got set up and thought about the subject being there, with Peter sitting across the little round table and the sun flooding in through the door to the right, and felt the canvas in front of me, felt the edges and the proportions, and then made a decision about where I thought the edge of the door should come, which seemed to be the most important thing to decide on first. And I can't remember, I can't remember how I got back to that at first. Anyway, I sort of, felt my hand on the canvas. Sorry, I keep on. You're going to edit this out.
I'm trying to dodge you, but
I didn't realise I've hit that quite a few times. That is you actually holding the mic, is it?
yes, the
I
microphone's
see.
about a foot from your mouth.
Oh golly, I didn't realise. God, it must be exhausting for you.
It's aching, but
Yeah.
it's not. It's a professional hazard. No, I'm all right.
Can't it be balanced on?
A stand.
How
Anyway.
No,
considerate
it's
of you.
fine.
Anyway, if
Please
you're all
don't.
right,
I'm fine.
I've just got to keep my hand out of the way.
So you felt the
Yeah.
canvas. I think.
Anyway, so and then there was this weird moment when I thought, well, here goes. Got to put some colour down. Got to make a start. So, I mean, I knew. You see, I'd been painting for so long in a state of near blindness. I mean, according to Moorfields Eye Hospital, I was blind, not partially sighted. I'd been registered blind, not partially sighted, but blind since 1989. We're talking about 2005. So all that time I'd been painting really blind, you see, but not quite. I mean, it's so hard to say, because when I was painting, I could sort of see, and it's very hard to know quite what we're talking about here. But if somebody handed me a painting, that painting, say 6 weeks later when I was working on another one, I probably wouldn't know which way up it was.
You needed, you had a very helpful family too. Forgive me being so stupid, but I am not a painter by a long shot. And how did you find blue on your palette? How did you find the
that's
colours you needed?
That's easy. Just by routine. But you see, I'd been doing that for, what are we talking about? 15, 18 years or something. I mean, in my studio now, if you have a look, there's a shelf on a little dresser, and all the tubes of paint I use are laid out in order. Ultramarine on the left, then moving through rose, reds, oranges, yellows, like a spectrum, browns, and then in fact I have green in a slightly strange place, and then black, and then I have white somewhere else. And it's very important that people don't come along and put those tubes of paint in the wrong order. I mean, in fact, I usually know if they have, because I learn the feel of the tubes.
And can I ask you another thing?
Yeah.
When you say to me green, in your mind's eye, is there green?
Yes, but it's hard to talk about that. I'll try. I mean, the thing is, painters, there are sort of, in a way, two different. There's sort of what one might call sensation. Oh God, it's hard, this. The sort of experience of colour in life, coloured light coming into the eye, but all of that's complicated too. I mean, if we're going to talk about Monet, then that might be something we need to talk about, because it isn't. Colour perception is not based on simply the wavelength of light coming from the place where you see the colour. That does not tell you what colour you see there. Nearly everybody still thinks it does, and most of the people who write about it write as if that's the case, but it isn't. And ever since Edwin Land, the inventor of Polaroid, did a lot of experiments in the late 50s, I think it was, and then this was taken up by neurologists like Semyazeki, it's been known that actually colour perception works in a much more complicated and subtle way, which I know quite a lot about and can talk about, but that would take a while. But it's very relevant in terms of painting, and particularly painters like Monet. Well, there aren't any painters like Monet, but you know what I mean. Where was I? Anyway, but you see, painters tend to think in terms of particular pigments. You think ultramarine, you think cerulean blue, you think manganese blue, you think cobalt blue, you think monestial blue, you think quinacridone violet or rose, you think cadmium red, cadmium scarlet, cadmium orange. Do you see what I mean?
I do. I'm curious. You make me curious.
That I mean, painters vary, obviously, and really I should only talk about myself. But I know the pigments I use, and I know what happens when... I know what they look like when you paint them onto a white canvas thinly. I know what they look like when you paint them onto a white canvas thickly. I know what they look like when you paint one over another. I know what they look like when you mix them with white. Now, for a long, long time, I mean way back into the 80s, well let's say we moved here in 1990, moved to Suffolk from Peckham in 1990. And from shortly after that time, I stopped really doing any mixing of colour on the palette. I couldn't, when I just looked at a palette, I couldn't see well enough to see what I was doing. I could only make colour judgments actually on the painting. As soon as a colour had to give off a sensation, as soon as it had to look like the sky, or look like the sun on Tuscan stone, or look like the sun shining through foliage, or look like a certain sort of shadow on a hot terrace, I could tell whether that colour I'd put on the canvas was doing the job or not. I could see it there, and I straight away would be able to see it was too dark, or too saturated a colour, or too warm or too cool or something. And then I would modify it. I wouldn't mix up another colour on the palette. I would brush something over that colour to modify it. And in fact, I'd learnt this technique, not realising how incredibly useful it would be when I lost my sight, way back in the late 60s when I started using oil pastels a lot. And oil pastels are dry. They're like, it's sort of like sticks of waxy colour. And so you don't mix them up on a palette. If you want to get a colour which isn't just the colour of the stick of pigment, you get it by scribbling another colour over the top. So you might put down a blue, scribble some yellow over it. It gives you a green. It's too dark, so you scribble some white over the top. That makes it a bit too cool, so you scribble a bit more yellow.
I think you're describing a Monet.
Well, I'm very pleased you say that, you see, because I think that, I've got to be very careful about saying what Monet was doing, or because I think what we all do, all painters, tend to understand these great masters in terms of our own endeavours, and that's going to reduce them to a very modest level. You know, they're towering geniuses and we aren't. But I think, for all, with all that proviso, I think that a lot of the look of the surface of a Monet painting is more to do with that sort of thing than the way most people write about it, as if he was consciously weaving a particularly sort of beautiful texture. Do you know what I mean?
I know I have... what you're talking, I think, if I understand correctly, is it isn't a style. Oh,
I'm so thrilled to hear you say that. Style is a bad word. I don't like the word style. And, as it's the sort of thing, I've done a lot of teaching in my life, which again has actually curiously been very helpful when I've had to paint blind and use help from other people. But anyway, I can talk about that later if necessary. But, the sort of thing once said to students is, Rembrandt wasn't painting Rembrandts. He wasn't painting in the Rembrandt style. He didn't think, what shall I do? Shall I paint like Frans Hals? No, I think I'll paint like Rembrandt. It's all this style stuff is after the event.
Now, there is, however, now reference made always to the impressionist school. They didn't get on very well all the time, but those who, and if you had to interpret what it was, I suppose people would say those who painted in the same style.
Well, they would, but you see, that doesn't get you very far. Isn't that blackbird sensational?
Yes.
Listen to it.
Yes. That's a style.
Painting, what's it called, plein air. Painting directly from nature outdoors, I suppose, is the first distinguishing characteristic of Impressionism, if you're going to try and define it. And therefore, you could say, though this doesn't mean that other people couldn't be painting outdoors and be concerned about other things, but in the case of pretty well all of them, I would say, therefore, they were concerned with trying to paint to make an equivalent for natural light. And this was, it really was, it seems, it's hard to know this now without sort of studying it. It's the usual problem with history. You've got to get back into the mindset of the time and forget everything that's happened since then. But it was revolutionary. Paintings were not made outdoors. They were made, paintings to exhibit, proper, real paintings were made in the studio. And there were academic ideas about what a painting ought to be like, and it was based on a certain sort of idea about the old masters. When Monet went outdoors, that wonderful quote from Monet about the first time he agreed to go and paint outdoors with Boudin in Le Havre. I can't do it verbatim. It brings tears to my eyes every time I read it, because Monet was a brilliant caricaturist. He was young, astonishing. Monet was an extraordinarily brilliant and sort of confident and amazing man. But as a teenager, he made these astonishing sort of brilliant caricatures of famous people in Le Havre, and they sold quite well.
I'll bet they got him into trouble too
with the famous
famous people in Le Havre.
Could be, and I bet he didn't care. But in the same shop that exhibited these, they also exhibited paintings by this painter Boudin, who was painting outdoors, and the chap who ran the shop wanted to introduce Monet to Boudin, and Monet wasn't interested at all. He didn't want to, he looked at these little paintings and thought nothing of them. Anyway, eventually they did meet, and I think Monet was sort of a bit intrigued. I'm trying to remember my sort of art history here. But anyway, after quite a lot of sort of being asked and then him saying, no, I don't think so, he did go out and paint outdoors with Boudin. And there is this wonderful piece of writing by Monet about it. And he says, it was as if a veil was torn from my eyes.
Indeed.
And I understood at that moment what the life of a painter was and what it would be for me.
And do you know what else I read somewhere? One of the best things that happened for him was when paint could be put in tubes, so that he could carry it along with him on his outings. But listen, can I ask you one thing? Because we talked about colours, but there's one colour you didn't mention, black.
Yes, well, it's interesting that black, as you know, had a sort of curious. The very simple sort of line on black and impressionism is that they didn't use it, which is obviously not true. They did use black. Well, certainly Renoir used black a lot. Renoir was fantastic with black, but the thing is, I'm just wondering.
Well, I'm wondering about the loss of sight too, because, of course, Monet's cataracts came in a time when they were not as adroit. They weren't as able to operate as they could later.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm sure it must have had a profound effect on the colours that he used. And black is perhaps... all right, I'm going to be simple-minded and literary type here.
Yeah, go for it.
Black may have been what was feared.
Don't know. I'm trying to remember the cataract paintings of Monet, those paintings in the Musée Marmottan. I've just been sort of my wife was reading me stuff about this last night, and about the sort of history of his eye defects, and it all seems to be much less clear and more muddly than certainly in my case. The growth of my cataracts, the effect it had on my perception, and then the effect of having them removed was pretty kind of straightforward and explicable. From what I've managed to read about it, this is from Patrick Trevor Roper and also an account in a book called Monet et Giverny, which is fairly detailed about this. It seems all much more much harder to interpret, actually, and over a much longer period of time, because he had them diagnosed in 1912, and I mean, some of the quotes seem to suggest that it was only in his right eye, but then in another book, which was much more detailed about it, it seemed to say that it was diagnosed in both eyes.
I think it was diagnosed later in both eyes, but
with-
never as
with a
radical as
difference.
your...
I mean, in the book we read, it said in the left eye, the chap said his vision was down to about 1/10 of normal vision. And in the right eye, which is the one he had operated on, but much later, it was slightly hard to understand the phrase that was used, but I think probably worse than that. But it still had a sort of good sense of shape or form, and I think that the colour, they seem to say, was, or was it of strong colours? Yes, that he could.
He did start
The
using
implication
reds.
seemed to be that I mean, what I found surprising was that the implication was that the cataract seemed to have affected his two eyes differently.
I read that too. He was profoundly myopic before,
Yeah,
apparently,
me too.
before, yes. Myopia is interesting because you like Japanese art, don't you?
Yeah.
And so did he.
Yes,
and
he was,
do you know that according to some ophthalmologists, the Oriental races tend to be myopic?
Yes, I know. Yes.
It makes
Yeah.
red very popular
Yes,
with
I
them.
I think those are sort of connections one should resist, actually. But you see, I mean, in Monet's case, yeah, they diagnosed him in 1912. Well, then, you know, it wasn't until 11 years later, 23, that he had an operation in that right eye. Well, he had 3 during that year, didn't he? The first 2 fairly quickly, one after another, I think, and then a third operation some months later. And then he was never operated on in the left eye, was he?
No, I don't think so.
And then, in fact, 3 years later, he died. But you see, his cataracts, I assume, must have grown much more slowly than mine.
I think there was never such a radical disability in his case. But what was that? There was some question I was longing to ask you. Oh, I know. I don't think anyone thinks of blue tack as an artist's aid, and I'd like you to explain to me just how you use blue tack to find your way around the piece you're working on.
I mean, it's, you know, I mean, art's a process of invention. I mean, there is craft involved, but to think of it as a craft is to miss the point. There's a thing I always like quoting, which was actually Philip Larkin talking about poetry for him, and he said something like, poem is oh bugger, I've forgotten it.
Sometimes.
A verbal. What's the word?
Device.
Verbal device. That's it. Is a verbal device.
Sorry, could you start the phrase again?
Yeah.
Get it in one go.
Sure.
Poem, yeah.
Thank you.
No, Philip Larkin said that poetry for him was a verbal device capable of preserving an experience against oblivion. Now, I was just so thrilled when I read that, because I thought that, you know, changed verbal advice to visual device. And that's what painting is for me. And I believe it's what painting is for the painters who interest me most, who are the painters for whom the subject was essentially visual experience. I mean, not all painting is about visual experience, obviously. But and visual experience isn't a completely defined thing which, isolates it from other sorts of experience.
However, your visual experience is unique. Each of us has a unique visual experience.
Sure, good.
And
So therefore you can't learn, nobody else can tell you how to paint your visual experience. You can pick up some tips. You can sort of have a look at Monet and say, well, that's how he painted his visual experience. Maybe that sort of visual language will help me. But then this is when I think artists divide, because you get academic artists who carry on, as it were, trying to paint Monets as best as they can. They wouldn't say that, but in effect that's what they're doing. Academic artists it's a kind of pastiche. Or what I would call true artists, who use whatever they can borrow in order to get closer to their own experience. And that's clearly what the great artists have done. And if they're people like Monet or Cézanne or Picasso, that leads to innovation, because their own experience is so far away from what has been painted by other people. And they have the artistic genius to invent new ways of using their materials in order to preserve those experiences against oblivion, and we are the beneficiaries.
And to preserve those experiences even against the loss of sight, then. Which you have done.
Yeah, well, that's... yes, that gets you into another realm, I suppose. But anyway, I haven't answered your question about blue tack. But you see, what I'm saying is that I made this first picture. I painted for about an hour on it, and I think, yes, it was because, anyway, some of my family were around at the time, and I think it was Charlotte, our oldest child, was sort of nearby, and I said, Charlotte, come and have a look at this. What do you think? And she said, oh, God, Dad, that's amazing. So I said, well, what's it look like? And she said, well, it's very beautiful. And I said, yeah, but can you see, what's going on? She said, well, that looks like, is that Peter sitting across a little table? And is that a window? And is that bright sun coming through a door on the right? And I said, yeah, spot on. Great. And so I thought, well, maybe it's possible. And really, I just, as the saying goes, never looked back. I've just carried on, and I painted all those calico subjects, about 12 or 13 of them, one after another. That took me, I don't know, about 18 months or something. And had a show which was very successful. That was a funny old business, because my dealer and I were slightly wondering how we were going to play all that. But anyway, when the pictures seemed to be all right, and then even later on, when they all excuse me, when they're virtually all sold, we thought, fine, well, we don't have to be coy about this anymore. But no, the blue tack, you see, I could kind of, I could do the colour. It's the opposite of what most people would think. I sort of knew in my head about the colour, and I knew pretty much how my pigments behaved. And from time to time, I would get a bit of help if I needed it. I'd ask Frances, I'd say, is that lighter than that? And she'd say, no, it's darker. And then I say, oh, bugger. And then I might put, some more white in and say, what about that? Or I might even say, not then actually, I can't remember actually whether, did I ever get you to mix up paint for me when I was painting the Calico's pictures? I don't think so. I think that came later. Now I do. In a way, the longer I go on with the painting, the more help I need, because I slightly lose my grip on. When I start, I have a sort of clear idea in my head and a pretty clear idea of what's going to happen when I start painting it. But then as the picture develops and changes, which it does actually, that's perhaps seems surprising, but it does, both in drawing and in sort of colour harmony, then my sort of confidence in knowing what's on the canvas is reduced, and I need more help from Frances, and I ask her to mix up colours for me. I mean, she doesn't decide what they're going to be. We sort of do that in consultation. Anyway, I still haven't got back to the blue tack.
Well,
so
you've now distracted me with the beauty of a marriage.
the thing of the the thing about the blue tack is you know, you need to be able to get back to the same place on the canvas again. And to begin with the cataracts pictures, I just marked off distances from the edge of the canvas with rubber bands on brush handles and on my folding white stick for bigger dimensions. And so I'd know that the sort of edge of the window was this far across from the right-hand edge. So I'd hold up my stick and I got an elastic band, and I knew that that elastic band was there. And that the windowsill was this far up from the bottom, and that was a different elastic band. And so then I could put my finger on that point, my right hand, I'm left-handed, and then with the paint which I got already mixed up on a brush on my left hand, I would sort of whack it down more or less in the right place, I hoped. Now, in one big picture in the Cataracts series called Black Windows, there was a particular place which was quite a long way from both edges, which became very sort of key in the exploration of the space. It was kind of a bit like the hub of a wheel. Things sort of spun out from it in a kind of vortex in all directions. It was a very important sort of position, and it was a real bore to sort of get to it, because it was quite a long way from the right-hand edge and some way up from the bottom. And at some point I suddenly thought, I'll just shove a blob of blue tack on there, because then I can find it and I don't have to piss about measuring from the edges every time. And that was terrific. It saved a lot of time. And then by the time I'd finished that painting, I had about 8 bits of blue tack on in different positions. And then when I started, there was then a bit of a lull. I finished all those pictures and I didn't know what to do next. And I thought a lot about what could be subjects. And then a sort of ongoing worry started up, because those were the last, as it were, seen subjects which I had. Not seen very well, but, you know, I knew about that. And then, so I started painting pictures of Frances sitting in a chair in the studio, and I got so close that I could feel most of her. And so the kind of perceptual input was tactile, but in my brain I could turn that into a visual experience. But then I had this blue tack thing going, you see, and so more or less straight away I started mapping out different positions on the canvas with blue tack, and also doing a certain amount of measuring of the subject. That's a tricky subject which I could talk about, but it's a bit complicated. I think we probably better not go into
I think
that.
I saw a portrait of Frances at the gallery where the blue tack was in evidence. It made a rather wonderful kind of abstract pattern, I thought.
Yes, it's funny that there's, I mean, when I finished these pictures with bits of blue tack stuck all over them, there was a debate as to whether I should leave them on or not, and there was one school of thought which said, along the lines of, I suppose, what you might call more modern art theory, that, you know, it was part of the process and therefore part of the invention and should be left. And, I'm not uninterested in that. But I was worried about what would happen to blue tack in 30 years' time. I thought it might decompose and stuff. So I thought, well, anyway, the compromise we came to, which I still think is the right one, is that we removed the blue tack, but didn't do an invisible mend, so to speak. So when we take the blue tack off, Francis has a look at the picture, and if the sort of, you see, if a blue tack hasn't moved position ever, then there'll be a little tiny white disc there, which is very eye-catching, and we call them sore thumbs. And so Francis will probably put a little bit of colour on that to stop it being so distracting, not to make it invisible, because I am interested in the process, and I do think that set of positions is part of the painting.
You do bring something to my mind that I want to ask you about. I'm sorry, but because I think in terms of colour. But of course, when you lose your sight, you lose more than just the colour and shape. You lose distance. You lose over there as opposed to right in front of me. Do you know? And coming to terms with that must be very difficult.
Yeah. Well, you're spot on there, because we've got to be rather rigorous about what we're talking about here. This is a bit of an obsession of mine, because I think that most writing about art is insufficiently rigorous and moves between the subject and the surface of the painting in a rather indiscriminate way, often within the same sentence. It starts off talking about the subject and ends up, people talk about flat forms and all sorts of. There's a lot of absolute nonsense in art criticism, not just things I disagree with, things that don't make sense. But anyway, that's a bit of a hobby horse of mine. We'd better keep off that.
Not unless you're going to tackle the impressionists.
But anyway, in terms of the subject, life is still three-dimensional for me, but I can only experience it directly, well, mostly through touch, obviously, which has the limits of, my body extended. But I've managed to extend that. I'll come on to that in a minute. The white stick, the famous blind man's white stick, is an extension of that. You go along tapping things with the white stick, so you don't walk into them. Sound, there's a bit of spatial information in sound, and it's worth mentioning that there is something which could be absolutely accurately called sound perspective, because sound, broadly speaking, travels in straight lines like light, much more slowly, of course, and it bounces.
That's interesting.
Like light. So, and also you have the same sort of thing as aerial perspective in light, so that colours in the distance don't look the same as. You see, this is where I get obsessed with the necessary rigour, with the same colour seen near to. So let's use a sort of classic, corny example. A red London bus seen half a mile away gives a completely different sensation to the eye to an equally clean red London bus a few yards away. Now, I can tell you why that is, but it's because the air filters some of the light and scatters some of the light. But, there are sound optical reasons for this. But this gives rise to something called aerial perspective, and probably the first artist to understand this and order his painting in a unified way in relation to this was Claude Monet, and that gave his paintings an extraordinary sort of unity of light and space, which was new in art.
I'm sorry, I must ask you, because we're going to... one thing, another loss, I suppose, is that you no longer see the paintings of others.
You're right. You're dead right. Anyway, I just want to go back to that thing a little bit, because no. Because the thing is that I would love to paint landscapes now. I mean, all my seeing life, I was essentially a landscape painter. I always thought of myself as a landscape painter. I did paint other things, but and it's still sort of where my heart is, really. But landscapes are out of reach now, sort of literally. The pictures I paint now, the essence of the subject is all either literally touchable or touchable by extension, because I now use long sticks to touch things which are further away than I can reach with my fingers, and I hold long sticks up to my eye so that it's like a kind of ray of light coming from that place, and work out the sort of three-dimensional geometry and turn that into a two-dimensional geometry.
So you are in some ways less an impressionist now than you were.
Yeah. Well, in terms of what's normally understood by Impressionism, the pictures I painted of Francis, the next exhibition after the cataracts ones, I suppose you wouldn't really call them Impressionism, because I wasn't consciously painting about light. I was certainly using colour, and I was thinking very much about what that colour would look like on the canvas. And I was also, sorry, that blackbird is just wonderful.
And do you think that Ryan had birds to tell him how far away the tree was?
But it wasn't, those paintings weren't about imagined or remembered play of light. But then what I'm doing now is, again, the paintings in my last exhibition were all about imagining the light in these subjects which I could touch, or most of which I could touch. And but you see, I could imagine the light and the colour in the landscape, but it's the drawing that's the problem. I've kind of got no way of making contact with it, unless something comes along which is so powerful in my imagination or my memory that I can keep returning to it and holding on to it. I hope that's going to happen very much.
Can I ask you a very down-to-earth, silly question that I like to ask people who paint? What do you listen to when you're painting?
That varies. I used absolutely to want to paint in silence. I mean, in fact, I painted out of doors, so it wouldn't be silence probably. But, you know, I was always rather sort of dismissive of painters who had music playing in their studio while they were painting. But when I became perforce a studio painter, I found occasionally, I mean, when I did try listening to music in the past, I mean, sometimes in the winter, if I was painting a still life or something, which I didn't like painting, but, you know, if the weather was bad, I had to paint that. I'd put on music, and I'd listen to the first few bars, and then the next thing I'd hear was sort of, you know, because the record had come to the end, and a couple of movements of a, you know, Mozart quartet or something had gone by, and I hadn't heard a single note. But now I do sometimes listen to music. Best of all is cricket. My favourite thing is to listen to cricket commentary, Test Match Special. That's perfect because it's sort of it keeps on going more or less the same, and it's all of interest to me, but it isn't. I mean, there is a kind of narrative. Obviously, the game develops, but you don't have to follow the story.
You are really charismatic. Yes, because I was thinking sometimes when I listen to you, I hear the engineer, the mathematician,
Yeah.
and then I hear the artist, and they seem compatible in you.
I think it's taken me a long time to bring them together. And you see, it's very funny this, because people who, the people who care about my paintings, my fellow artists, my family, the marvellous people who buy them, by and large, I think the consensus is that I'm painting better now than I was when I could see. Now, that seems a bit strange. And one has to sort of, well, one has to have to, but I've got a pretty analytical mind, and I want to try and understand that if I can. And the explanations I've come up with tentatively are, on the one hand, I think when I could see, I was too influenced by other artists. I was always, in the thrall of the great painters like Monet and Cézanne and Matisse and Titian and Rembrandt and all the people I adored, and Bonnard, and probably a bit overwhelmed by them, maybe. And now that I can't see their paintings anymore, I just have to rely on my memory of them, which people tell me is good. It doesn't seem any good to me, but they are still important, all right. So I think that's meant that I've just had to be more my own man. But I think there are other things, like what you were referring to just then, that in order to make pictures at all, I've had to involve certain sort of analytical and intellectual sides of me, which are a very real part of me, but which on the whole, in the past, when I could see, didn't sort of get into the picture, the cliche fits, in the way that they do now. So I think probably the pictures I paint now are more of me than they were, maybe. I don't know.
There I heard the artist. More of me. No, that's good.
And there's also sort of emotional stuff involved, which I've always been probably very English, you would say, about this. But my conscious concern was always what I saw, and a desire to be truthful to the not me, which I found inspiring. That, getting back to Larkin, that experience that one wanted to preserve. It's a very, very strong feeling for certain sorts of artists that certain things about the not you, the world out there, just are so moving and wonderful and beautiful or touching or whatever, that you want to preserve them. Now that is the motive for me. That's what a subject is for me. Not for all artists, but it is for me.
And I would suspect, you know what came to my mind also was a Monet.
Well, I think so, you see. I think I think Monet, that's what I want to call a realist. It's not quite the use of the word that art historians and critics normally use. They have a slightly different sort of use for it. But I want to call people for whom a subject which is in some essential way outside them but impresses them, that is the subject. I want to call the people who feel a strong desire to be true to that, realists. And I'm convinced that Monet was such a painter all his life, and the sort of suggestion that in the late years he kind of gave that up rather and became more of what people would call an abstract painter, I think is not true. And you see, the thing is that all painting is abstract painting, because that is the means of communication. It's a flat pattern of colours. That's what a painting is. You know, in the way that music is a lot of, you know, sounds, sequential sounds. But by that means, it is possible to communicate something else. It's possible to be a figurative artist, and in the case of music, which I think probably is figurative, it's emotional experience which is being expressed by and large. I mean, so, you know, there's more water music and all that sort of stuff
these
too.
days it's utterly intellectual
Well,
experience.
yes, I think, I mean, exactly, and as it is for a lot of visual art, and that's fine. You can do anything you like. It doesn't interest me so much.
Hear, hear.
But you see, the point is, what happens, I think, in art criticism is that when the critic can recognise the subject as distinct from its means of making them aware of it, i.e. the coloured pattern, which is the painting, they call it figurative in some sense or another. When they find it hard to recognise the subject, to name things, they say that the painting is abstract. And it's very facile, this.
I must say, I agree. I think you better, because we're running.
Excuse me. Can I just... there are a couple of just little
Yes, of course.
tiny things that we didn't actually say that you went on a trip with your son to cateches. We just we assumed the audience might know that.
Oh,
so
right.
could you just give me a couple of sentences on my son took me to cateches, or what happened, please?
Yeah, sure. In 2005, I went to Cadaqués in Spain with my son Peter, who is a photographer and a filmmaker. And he had for a time a plan to make some sort of documentary film about me and my painting. And in fact, this was planned as possibly happening in the autumn of that year, when another friend of his, the Magnum photographer Donovan Wiley, had said that he would like to be involved in the project. And so we went off to Cadaqués almost as a sort of dry run, and Peter, at the last minute, decided that he would do it. He bought a recorder and a recording machine and some radio mics, and he had a small movie camera, so he kind of filmed and recorded me for the whole of these 3 weeks. I mean, I couldn't have moved without him, because it's very sort of precipitous and full of steps and ramps and everything. I mean, just the sort of subject that I adore, but I mean, I would have killed myself on the first morning if Peter hadn't been with me. And of course he looked after me and, you know, cooked my dinners and things. We had a great time. It was wonderful. And then the day after we got home, we got back on the 29th of May, well, the day before. The 29th of May was my birthday, and the whole family were here for it. And then the next morning I went totally blind. So Peter suddenly was in this position where the dry run had to be the real thing. And then he spent quite a long time making this film.
Why cateches?
Why Cadaqués was because it was April, and it was. What am I talking about? It was May, wasn't it? We wanted sun, pretty well reliable sun. I wanted sea, because I love water. And I wanted somewhere where there was a town that rose fairly steeply from the sea, so that one could be looking across orange roofs out to deep blue sea, past white walls in sun and shade and that sort of thing. And in fact, to begin with, we were going to go somewhere else in Spain, but then...
Because it's Darley's.
No, not for that at all. In fact, to be honest,
You'd rather not.
I didn't even exactly, I don't like Dali.
I knew that.
Picasso painting cataracts.
Picasso was a genius of, again, a strange mix. I saw his humorous paintings. I couldn't believe it. There was an exhibition of his funny paintings at the one I can never remember the name of the Gargosian. And I was doubled up laughing in front of some.
Wonderful exhibition, yeah.
Wasn't it astonishing?
Well, you see, there again, I talk about it as if I've seen it. I went there with my wife, and we had a lovely time, and she, a lot of the pictures I knew, and ceramics and things, some I didn't. But I mean, I go around exhibitions a fair amount now, and mostly with Francis, but with my painter pals, and we talk about the pictures, and then afterwards I sort of talk as if I've seen them.
But you sort of have seen them.
Yeah.
There were an awful lot of painters who had problems with vision.
Sure.
Monet's became pronounced.
Yeah.
Do you feel any special connection or sympathy with Monet?
I'd love to say I do, but I don't think it would be honest. I mean, I love him because of his painting, and one's interested in the life and personality of the artists one most admires, and some of them are, seem much nicer chaps than others. But I don't think I'm like that. I don't think I sort of go in for that sort of empathic relationship with people I don't know. I don't know how to answer that.
When you saw a Monet landscape, and you, who have had terrible troubles with your vision for a long time, did you recognize anything of his visual problems?
Oh, well, yes. But you see, the thing is, this is only an extension of something that's interested me the whole of my life as a painter, because I have always been interested in what I would call perceptual painting about direct visual experience. And probably this does tie in with my more scientific side. I've always been interested in the nature of visual perception. I've read quite a lot of books about perceptual psychology and disagreed pretty strenuously with some of the experts in the field, and been very thrilled to read other people, and have done in my time, I suppose, what one would call perceptual experiments and things. And I actually think I hit on a particular explanation of certain visual. We'll cut this out. This is too much of a digression. I was going to do a bit of boasting then.
Don't mind boasting.
No, he doesn't.
But
no, I know. I noticed that. We've got
but the thing is that you see, what I found in my own painting, which was, I suppose, I mean, all these things grow gradually, because you sort of get up and you start drawing and painting, and and then you do it, and then you go to bed, and then you do the same thing the next day, and over the weeks and months and years, your ideas develop and everything. So you can't really say, and then I discovered I was a painter. It doesn't happen like that. You're a painter because you do it. If you give it up, then you aren't. And if you go on doing it, then you are. You might not be any good. That's another matter altogether. But I discovered that the act of painting changed the way the world looked to me. Now, I mean that absolutely as objectively as you can say when you're talking about perception, which is by definition subjective. But I'm not talking about anything emotional or narrative or anything like that. I'm just saying that quite literally the act of painting can change the colour you see, the light you see, the experience of space you see, and it changes it for the better. Now, the idea which has been so exciting to me and important is that I think that drawing and painting are a means of exploring the real world, and that painters, certain painters, the ones who are concerned with this sort of exploration, are experts in this field. You know, in the same way that people who work for scent factories have trained their sense of smell, and they can detect smells and relationships of smell that the rest of us can't. It's as simple as that, and everybody is perfectly happy with that. And the same with tasters, wine tasters, tea tasters. They can taste a glass of wine and tell you, you know, which side of the valley the vines were on and which year it was and that sort of thing. I can't tell them that, probably can you. And everybody's perfectly happy with that. That's fine, they say. They're experts. They've given their life up to that. But if you say, and painters can see things that you can't see, people don't like that. But it's true. We're experts. We've given our lives to this. And somebody like Monet, who was, you know, gave a very large part of his long life, 60 years or so, and was a total genius, just saw more, understood more through his eyes than possibly anybody else ever has in the history of the world. Now that is a thrilling thing to me. And the sum of what he saw and discovered and understood is preserved in those paintings. And if we have the right sort of interest and the right sort of energy and the right sort of humility, we can share some of those discoveries. Now that, for me, is the glory of art. That's why I'm getting quite emotional now.
That was absolutely wonderful. Oh dear. All right, then let me ask you a silly one. If Monet walked in here right now, what would you say to him?
Thank you.
I think that might be mutual, you know.
Oh,
I've got a hunch.
He'd say, what's this awful pastiche rubbish?
No, you're really, I do recognise your humility, but you are an extraordinary artist.
Shall we look at some of...
Oh,
could
yes,
we...
please, I want to see.
Thank you for providing the end to my programme as well, by the way.
That
Just
was
from a professional
amazing.
point of view, that was brilliant.
That was so
With the
good.
blackbird fading out.
Oh, God.
This one isn't actually in the book, I think.
cataract paintings.
When you say these are cataract paintings, you mean these are paintings done
These were done
When you
before I
got-
had the operation.
before the operation?
So my sight was blurry and darker, and really quite blurry, and bright lights sort of broke up.
But the points of light are closer
and the
to
colours, all the cool colours were terribly diminished. Because that's what I mean. If you just hold up a bit of orangey brown tissue paper and look through it, I'll give you some idea of what it's like looking through a cataract.
Because you had the yellow-brown
I had
cataracts.
the yellow
the
ones.
same
I was
ones
thrilled.
that
You see,
now-
when I had cataract, when they were diagnosed, of course, you know, I thought of Monet, of course I did. And I thought, oh God, I hope I've got the orange-brown ones, because I want all this sort of amazing world of brilliant blues and turquoises and violets. And I had them, and oh God, it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. There's a picture there, Fran, which...
The blue came afterwards, didn't it?
Which, the sort of same, it's not literally the same motif, but it's to within a few feet of... But those two will give you some idea of the difference, the before and after. In fact, you see... it's curious.
This is the after.
I've had an idea.
The blue came back.
Hang on.
You've given me a wonderful idea. I don't know if it'll happen, but maybe I could paint from memory.
Oh right, yeah.
Because that after. The funny thing about that picture, the after, the cataract picture, is that at the time I thought it was really, really bright colour. But compared with the sort of colour I've been using the last 20 years, it's not very strong, is it?
Not really, no.
But maybe now I could paint a picture which was more like the experience I was having then. Maybe what a thought. God, I'd love to do that. Ha-ha.
Could we have a description? Francis, maybe you could describe the before one and then the after one.
Yes,
So
Sargy's better at that than me.
okay, well, whoever's better.
No.
So just a brief...
But so Sargy, I've got your blue after the operation
with the trees
painting
and
with
the
the
one-
trees and the very bright blue stuff on the ground.
Yeah.
And to the right of that is again in the sort of spinny at the bottom.
Same area, right.
Same sort of area, but
and
very, very... it's extraordinarily sort of...
It's sort of reddy, browny,
Pinky,
rosy, pinky, isn't it?
pinky,
with
yellowy.
white, yellowy white.
Yellowy white about the
Right.
place.
Okay.
Very different. And another one that's... But that's clearly cataracty and orangey.
Okay, well, I'll just describe those two then. Are we go?
Yes.
And there's the one on the right, the
Cataracty
one. Okay, well, the picture on the right, which is was I painted when I had my cataracts before they'd been removed, and by that time, my sight had become very sort of blurry and rather dark, and sort of grainy, and any bright lights tended to sort of break up, and all the cool colours, blues, greens, violets, cool roses, were pretty much getting filtered out by this orangey brown filter, which is what the cataract was. And in that painting, it's pretty sort of reddy, browny, pinky shadow, and the lights where the sun is on the leaves, or I can't even remember now whether I think it was sort of sun reflecting off shiny leaves. They're kind of yellowy white. And the painting on the left, which was painted after my cataracts had been removed, and was very nearly, it was only a few yards away from the subject of the first one, though it isn't exactly the same. For a shortish time after my operations, my eyes were just flooded with all these short wavelengths of light which had been filtered out by the cataracts. So all the short end of the spectrum, the blue, the violet, the cool greens, turquoises, and the sort of magentas, which, magentas had been sort of browned off by the filters. All these cool colours were coming through fantastically strongly. And it was like, I just can't begin to describe how beautiful it was, it was like a sort of extraordinary Aladdin's cave, because every little reflection of the sky was like a sort of sapphire. One of the attractions of this place was that there was lots of ivy and bay and green ground cover with shiny leaves. So and it was very bright sun at the time. It was in June or July. And it was just staggeringly beautiful.
I see this as a new definition of enlightenment.
But the reason for this, you see, is that the brain is adjusting the whole time. I mean, it's the whole. Oh dear, I'd love to go into the land business now.
Yes, but do you know something I would like to ask you, because I'm finding it very interesting? The distance one stands from the painting makes a big difference. Do you know? Especially the one, the brown one, the cataract.
Yeah.
When I stand back a few feet, it's almost a different painting. It has a different quality.
Well, that's something that people always say about, I suppose, what one might call painterly paintings. Paintings where the paint has not been put down in order to sort of imitate in the most fine way the look of the subject, but where the paint has been allowed to be and so to speak, enjoy its painterly quality. I mean, going to get involved in 19th and 20th century art history.
The only problem is
you want to say quickly
yes,
that you haven't explained quite why. I think this is important. That while you had the cataracts, your brain was trying to whiz the blue up. So that's why it got more blue afterwards.
I was just going to do that actually when I got distracted, as I always do. The thing is that well, progressively over time, quite quickly in my case, much more slowly in Monet's, I think, these cataracts grow and they begin to, they darken, they cut out the light getting through to the retina, but they also, particularly if they're the orange-brown ones that Monet and I had, they particularly cut out the short wavelengths, the blues, the greens, the violets. Now, your brain knows that you're still seeing the same world that you were seeing before, and so it compensates for this. And so it beefs up, where you're getting this sort of pale, sort of muddy blue coming through. The brain will, to the best of its ability, compensate for this and beef it up a bit. When the cataract is suddenly removed, the brain is still beefing up this colour, which doesn't need beefing up. And so it comes through looking fantastically bright and thrilling. And then in a few weeks, far too quickly, the brain recalibrates back to where it was before the cataract started growing, and the world goes back to looking its sort of usual beautiful self, but not sensational anymore.
You used the word thrilling. That was brilliant.
So this is where you work?
Yeah, I do the painting down that end.
Space.
But I want to. You see, can I just say something else? Are we still turned on?
Yes.
You bet.
Not many people who aren't painters understand what the problems are of trying to make equivalents for natural light out of coloured paint on a flat surface. The colour isn't the problem. Coloured pigments are made out of all the most coloured things in nature, roughly speaking. The problem is the intensity of light. because on a flat canvas, the maximum contrast of light you've got, of light intensity, is the difference between black and white in the same light, whereas the difference of intensity of light in nature is tens of thousands of times more than that. I can't remember the figure. It might even be higher than that. So the problem for the painter of light is how to, using this piddly little range of black to white, represent sunlight and shadow, or all the sort of extraordinary range of light that the eye responds to. Now, the sort of old masterish kind of way of doing it, oh yeah, I hate saying this, it's so facile, but is to make a sort of tone. Tone is how light and dark something is, a kind of tone model of what you're looking at. This was, well, Corot was the absolute master of this, and he passed that on to Pissarro, and it was the beginning of the sort of impressionist language, really. A perfect tone model. So, white, as it were, is your lightest, which is going to be nothing like as light as the bright light you see in your subject. And black is your darkest. And then, halfway is halfway. So straight away, the actual tone you're painting on your canvas is nothing like what you're looking at. But if you make a perfect tone model, it works. But the trouble with that way of painting is that in order to keep it being a perfect tone model, in the same way that you have to represent contrasts of light by incredibly reduced contrasts of tone on your canvas, of necessity, you must make correspondingly reduced contrasts of colour. Otherwise it doesn't work, and I could explain why. But now I think that Monet, realising as painters, I mean, an awful lot of the bright pigments that we take for granted now were being invented in the sort of early and middle part of the 19th century. So they hadn't been around very long. Bright colours were very precious to the old masters, and they were used sparingly. The Impressionists had buckets of colour, but they sort of, the problem was how to use it, and in such a way that the painting represented a believable space and light, rather than just a coloured hodgepodge. And I think that Monet actually made, in a sense, the breakthrough. I think it just happened by painting. And this is to do with something I think I said earlier on, where painting makes the world look different, or can do, if you're prepared to let it. And I think that by desperately trying to paint as truly as possible the light and the intensity of light that he saw in nature, out of doors, using the mass of colour but this very limited range of tone from black to white, what actually happened was that Monet's brain started to be flexible. I mean, it's quite recently neurologists have discovered, I think they talk about brain plasticity, that there's far more capability in the brain than had been thought possible even 10 or 15 years ago. And I think artists have known about all of this.
Well, vision uses the brain more than any other sense.
Exactly.
But as his vision changed, I suppose the brain had to adapt to that as well.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about in the cataract period.
Yes, when the cataracts, and they came slowly.
Yeah.
So he must have almost one day said, "Strange, that's not the way it was yesterday."
Yes, extraordinary. No, I mean, I think, the brain is amazingly flexible and has astonishing capabilities if you make sufficient demands on it.
May I say, some brains more than others. So there.
Yes,
Yes,
any
I'm
minute
afraid.
now.
Yes, because
Is it due now?
how did
He does know how to
I
come up,
think
doesn't
so.
Um,
I'm not sure. My watch
can I
is misbehaving.
very quickly show you the last picture I finished. Where am I?
You're next to
your
your drum
drums.
kit,
Kicking the wine.
back door.
Aha!
Because
The
Oh, in the
last
house.
picture.
we've been talking. Yeah, the big
Oh yeah, oh in the
picture.
house.
Oh.
Oh right, quick.
Um,
Can you just say for me as we go out, so this is your studio?
So this is your studio.
It's a nice studio.
you're all right. You said 1:15, didn't you?
Yes.
It's only 1:06 now.
I don't know my watch. Oh, my
It's just a bit fast.
I've never heard of a watch going fast. They go slow. It's a good thing this didn't happen before I did that. Understood.
Oh, what a grand house! Shall I close?
Yes.
Doesn't matter. Oh, we're going that way. Okay.
Oh, what a charming house.
This is my idea of heaven.
This is a piece of blind man's architecture you see here. I designed all this.
Aha!
Anyway, that.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, lordy.
It's all right.
Thing. Are you all
No,
right?
I'm fine, thank you.
let me-
Yes. Just the jugular, just straight for the jugular.
That's it.
Still, I'm still
That's
breathing.
it.
So that's that. I've only just finished that, and that I suppose took about 5 months.
I'm
probably.
looking at the big one. And
Yeah, big.
Oh, wow! Because your canvas has got your painting space got bigger too,
Yeah.
didn't it?
Yeah. Well, I sort of like, at the moment, you see, what I really feel comfortable with is painting figures virtually life size. I mean, that picture, you see, I haven't really got time to do all this properly. But that picture actually was set up here. So, I don't know if Franny's moved this table. The blue tack, you see, not just on the painting, but marking, no,
Oh, there's blue tack on the floor.
blue tack on the floor, so that ought to go
Oh, I see.
there.
It's a map.
And I have to stand
Right, now if you stand with your leg against there, okay. Franny, come and take up your position, your standing position.
Okay.
Right. Francis is there. That's one of their positions. I'm going to be very unconvincingly another Francis, which is here somewhere. Reading a book. Do you see? And then there's a third Francis there, kneeling, looking
You
out of
imagine
the,
that was a
the
window.
imaginary window,
And
through
imagine
which
that
the
that was
imaginary
the scene.
sea is seen, and through which the imaginary sun is coming.
I see.
And and you see from there, if I take up the station point,
Wait, you're in the.
I mean, it's
Out
a
of the
huge. Where's the blue tack gone? There. It's a huge wide-angle view. It's from there right round to there. It's 180 degrees left to right, and from there down to about there vertically. So you see, I can touch her here. There's actually, do you see in the corner a cardboard cylinder?
With,
Yes.
That's a stand-in Francis. So I prop that up here if she's not around. Have you gone away?
It's Laura right in front of you
No.
with the microphone. That's my shoulder. That's
Oh, that's you. Sorry.
That's
Well,
fine.
you'll do very nicely.
I'm not sure.
And then holding sticks and things,
oh, you can tell you.
I can check across, and sometimes I could do with 3 arms. I hold 2 sticks, pointing back to my eye as if they were rays of light, and then I can measure across them, and that will tell me what that proportion is in compared to something else. It's quite complicated.
Wow, the engineer emerges.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.